Hi everyone, this is Isaac Steincamp and I'm back on the Chess Summit Network. And let me just say, it's been a while since I've said those words, but I'm really back this time and I hope that this will be a more regular thing that I'm doing. In the last couple of weeks I've been thinking about my goals for the 2015-2016 school year after finishing off the summer kind of strong, and I've decided that my goal this year is to win the US Junior Open in 2016 in New Orleans. That'll be in June, and I'm going to do everything I can to prepare for that tournament between now and then. I'm rated close to 2100 now, and I'm pushing for that Candidate Master title, and I think I'll be earning that sooner rather than later, and I think that that's all the more reason to be optimistic towards going for first place. Now that I have a goal and I know what I'm working towards, I'm hoping that I can start coming out with 2 blog posts a week, as well as 1 additional YouTube video every week, to help kind of document my journey to New Orleans between now and then, and kind of show how I'm improving, what I'm doing, but also what I'm doing over the board to help you become a much better chess player. So that being said, I wanted to show a game that I played at the Washington International this past August in Rockville, Maryland, in a tournament that, frankly, I was not expecting to do well in. I had just come off the Potomac Open. I had 3 draws and 2 losses, so 1.5 out of 5. I was playing the open section, so it wasn't completely abysmal, but when you go 5 games without a win, it kind of seems a little bit, poor. And for that matter, I'd been playing up enough that I'd gone 9 straight rated games without any wins. For that matter, I had a lot of draws, but this game and this tournament was a really big turnaround for me. As it showed me that when I was playing against my own rating level, I was playing at a much higher level. And since this tournament, I've kind of been much more consistent in terms of converting slightly better positions and understanding positions at a much higher level. So that being said, I wanted to talk today about static play. And if you've read Josef Dorfman's book about chess, which I believe is no longer out of print, he talks a lot about this idea of static and dynamic advantage, the sense that, if you can continue to evolve your position and your opponent can't really evolve his position, then you have a static advantage, and it's in your best interest to continue evolving that position until you've reached the best possible position you can get before attacking. Meanwhile, your opponent, when he's statically worse, he needs to find ways to break the position, change the pawn structure, make a trade, do something so he can stay into the game. And just by learning this concept alone, by kind of incorporating in my games, I've seen a lot of progress. And I wanted to show that in my first game, really using the system. So this was my first round game. I'm about 2,000. I'm playing someone high 1,700, low 1,800 rating range. And I honestly didn't know what to expect going into this round. As I said, I'd gone 9 straight rated games without a win. I'd had a lot of draws, but, when you're playing someone this lower rated than you, your mind is saying, hey, it'd be really nice if we could finally get a win out of this game. So my opponent kind of threw me for a loop for a little bit, and I thought we were going to go into a King's Indian, so I played g6, and he threw me off here with this move, knight to c3. And this move is a little bit tricky because as a Sicilian player and as a King's Indian player, I don't play the perk. So if I just casually make this move bishop to g7, my opponent can now play the move e4, and now we're in a perk. And I'd fallen for this trick once earlier in the year. I wound up drawing that game. Black has a lot of ways to get played, but if White knows theory and knows what he's doing, then then a black player who's not too familiar with the perk will have a hard time developing the ideas they want. So I decided that I didn't really want a perk, so I had to figure out how am I going to really make a claim for the position. Well, when my opponent played knight to c3, he played knight to c3 with one objective, to play e4. So for me, logically, the only way that I could really counter this move was to play the move that stopped him from doing what he wanted to do, which was d5. I'm gaining space, I'm developing. It seems very natural. So my opponent played a natural developing move, bishop to f4. And, at this point, we start developing normally. Bishop g7, e3, castles. I was a little bit hesitant during the game to castle. I remember this moment when he played e3, because I didn't know if he wanted to play a move like queen d2 and queenside castle. Because at that point, if he has this cutting diagonal to get to h6 and have castled kingside, well, then he might be able to also incorporate h4, h5 ideas. And when you're the stronger player, you want the game to kind of favor you. And I knew that my opponent probably had some sort of preparation here, where maybe he shouldn't play e3 but wait and play queen d2 and then try to figure out what to do with the light squared bishop. And so I wasn't quite sure when to castle. But as soon as he played e3, I kind of realized there's no venom behind this h4 move anymore. So I decided it was okay, and my opponent doesn't really have anything to show for it. So the game went along, bishop to e2, and I played this move b6. In all honesty, I was definitely on my opening preparation, but I liked the position that I had. And I had a couple reasons for liking this move b6. Well, for starters, I'm not so sure where this bishop on c8 could go, but I know I can harass his bishop on e2 with the move bishop to a6. On the other hand, it might behoove me to play a move like bishop to b7 and c5. So this move is multi-purpose, but I really played this b6 move to control the c5 square and really get the c5 move going. So that was my true intention with this move. Now my opponent, he gets a little bit ambitious. He doesn't really complete his king safety, but at least his development's complete when he plays this move knight to e5. And I had a realization here, I want to put my knight on d7 at some point. But if I play knight to d7, he's going to play knight to c6 and win the c7 pawn. And this could be a little bit annoying. I obviously can't play the move knight to c6 because I'd be hanging now that I've played b6. So, it seems like my opponent may have solved my position, but in reality, when your opponent doesn't really complete all of their opening objectives, it gives you an opportunity to kind of solidify and work forward. So I decided, okay, I'm going to play c6, and then I'm going to try to kick his knight away from e5. And if I can do that, then I'm doing totally fine. So my opponent castled, and now I needed a way to dislodge the knight from e5. If I can control this e5 square, my opponent has no stake in the center. And so, to make sure that this pawn on c6 was protected, and to kick this knight, I played the move knight on f to d7. With two attackers, discover attack through the bishop, and with the d7 knight now. And I'm also threatening this move f6. The f6 move is actually the more important idea, because now I can thrust for e5. And if I can have the control of the center, and have that same solid pawn structure that I currently have, then I should have some form of a static advantage. So my opponent plays f3, and his idea is to play this move e4. But unfortunately, he didn't really see my options, and because of that, he didn't exactly calculate what I could do, and it gave me this forcing sequence. Knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, I played the move f6, my opponent didn't see anything better but to play bishop to g3, and now I played the move e5, controlling the center. My opponent's going to have a hard time playing e4 now because I can play d takes e4 and then have pressure on the d4 pawn. I can play e takes d4 and then take on e4. I have a lot of options. My opponent, he's kind of boxed in, and he made a move that to me communicated that he was already desperate, and that was this move f4. I think my opponent was aiming for like a stonewall structure, but as you can see, this is not the right kind of structure to play for, because once I play this move e4, not only is his dark squared bishop really bad, but his light squared bishop also doesn't have any squares it can go to. So by making this move, he's really limited himself. Meanwhile, I've gained space, and even though I haven't exactly developed my pieces, I now have a lot of really good possibilities and squares for my pieces to be, unlike my opponent who's developed his pieces, but they're not harmonious with the pawn structure he's created. So I wasn't really too worried here. My opponent played the move queen to d2, kind of a nothing move. For me, this kind of communicated he didn't really know what he wanted to do. And here I was kind of like faced with my first decision. I realized, my opponent is worse, right? So he has to look for dynamic ways of breaking my position. And I thought one of them might be to try at some point to play f5. Sacrifice the pawn, or if you can play g4 at f5, which is less likely, then maybe he can open up this light square diagonal for his bishop. So I just played the move f5. I'm in no rush to really develop my pieces. My opponent doesn't have any threats. And the pawn on e3 almost acts like a wedge in his own structure, in the sense that it's really hard for him to get pieces from the king side to the queen side. So I played the move. My opponent played the move rook on f to d1, and here I had another decision to make. I know I want to develop my bishop. I don't know where my knight should go. So where do I put my bishop? Do I put it on a6 to trade the bishops, or do I put it on e6 to kind of just develop it naturally? Those are really my only two options. So why don't you pause the video and give it a little bit of a think. Okay, so this isn't exactly a tactical move. This is just a pure positional move. If I play the move bishop to a6, even if my opponent takes and I get to develop my knight for free, I run into the problem that my opponent is now less cramped. And if we look at the position, yes, the e2 bishop's annoying in that it covers a lot of light squares, but realistically, where can it move to? And that answer's not really that many squares. Now, my c8 bishop is limited by my pawn structure, but now, if we think about what does white want to do to get like a dynamic way of changing the pawn structure and changing the game, he only has two options. And if you're familiar with like stonewall versus stonewall structures or positions like that, then you should know that white's goal is to at some point get this move c4 going, or to get this move g4 going. And by playing bishop to a6, I eliminate a light square defender that had the opportunity to defend those two squares. Meanwhile, after bishop takes a6, knight takes a6, my opponent can just play queen to e2, and voila, he has another piece that can already, cover both g4 and c4. So realizing this and realizing that my opponent's very cramped right now, I made the better decision, which was to play bishop to e6. So here my opponent chose to play knight to a4, and I had to think a little bit here. I want to devote my knight, and I kind of knew that d7 was the square I had to go to, and potentially I could play the move c5. But after thinking for a little bit, I realized that my opponent had some annoying potential here. If I play this move knight to d7, my opponent didn't see it, but when I told him after the game, he realized that this move was very strong, because it makes it really difficult for me to get my queen on a square that I'd like it to be, like e7. And it becomes hard to play against a structure if white can get in this move c4. So I needed a prophylactic measure to allow me to play knight d7, but also at the same time stop him from queen to b4. So I think my next move was kind of self-explanatory, queen to e7. My opponent played the move c3, which to me kind of communicated that, again, he's playing for a draw, but he also doesn't really know what to do. If anything, he's completed the stonewall structure, but I have all of my pawns on the best possible squares here in the center, and he doesn't really have a way to maneuver around it, so this was not of concern to me. I played knight to d7, and my opponent played b3. Here I actually have a little bit of a threat. If I can play this move b5, white's knight has no squares. He has to play knight to c5, and he loses a pawn for no compensation. So he plays this move b3, and here I decided, okay, my pieces are in pretty strong squares. Let's go ahead and play c5. If white decides to take on c5, I can play b takes c5, and I have full control over the dark squared diagonal. This is actually a really big factor for me. Furthermore, this knight on a4 is offsides, and I can play moves like knight to b6 at some point. I can try to play rook d8, and then maybe even go for d4 ideas. White's dark squared bishop is on the wrong side of the board, and therefore doesn't really have the ability to counter my threats. So my opponent correctly realized that he can't actually do anything with this but hold the tension, so he plays the move knight to b2. So in this position, I've achieved a static advantage, meaning that I can continue to put my pieces on better squares, while my opponent doesn't exactly have better squares for his pieces. The knight on b2 is very limited in terms of where it can go. The two bishops don't actually have squares, and the rooks don't even have potential files that they can be on besides the d file. So here I just made very natural developing moves. My first move I played was rook on f to d8, and the idea here was that I was going to move this knight away from d7 to f8, opening up the d file, but the reason for moving it to f8 was so one day I can play it to h7. My goal here is, if I just sit and do nothing, well, the position's not going to change, but if I can create a pawn break with this move g5, then I might be able to gain some traction. The idea is that I play g takes f, or if my opponent plays f takes g, but mostly I'm playing g takes f with the idea of creating a passed pawn on the e file. If I can reach an endgame where this guy's path is unblocked by a pawn, then I'm in really good shape going into the endgame. So my opponent played the move a3. I wasn't really worried here. And I played the move knight to f8, just going ahead and continuing my plan. My opponent played the move b4, and this is the second real critical question for you guys. Should black take either the d or the b pawn? Okay, well, if you haven't solved it, pause your video, but in this case, it's not in black's best interest to take either way. No matter which way he takes, I'm assuming white's going to take with the backwards c pawn, which will allow this a1 rook to come to the c file and get some play. Black is probably still better, but why give white play when black is in full control of the position? Again, make sure white can't really get any counterplay and kind of dictate the pace of the game. So I just played the move c4. I'm getting rid of another square, b3. This square d3, good luck getting a piece on that. And he's never going to break on the queen side. This 2v2 structure over here will never get him anywhere. So my opponent played the move h3. And here I decided to continue my maneuvering plan with my knight, because I want my knight to be on a better square. So h6. And here my opponent played bishop to f2, which I thought was actually a really big mistake. You see, I thought the bishop belonged on h2, so it could protect the pawn on f4. So when I play g5, he doesn't have to play e takes f4 when I take on f4. He can take with the bishop, and then he can also bring the rook to f1 and have another protector. By playing bishop to f2, he really limits his options in defense. So here I realized I didn't need the knight on h7 to cover g5. I needed the knight on g6 to cover f4. So I played the move g5 first. My opponent played g3. I moved my king off the file. He moved his king off the file. Bishop to f6. Rook to g1. Knight to g6. So here I've maneuvered all of my pieces on the king side in terms of their best positions, and now it's just deciding what I want to do with my rooks. So here, my opponent played rook on a to f1, and I thought this was a really instructive moment of the game, because at this point, opening up the kingside seems a little bit riskier than it did 2 or 3 moves ago, because now my opponent's gotten both of his rooks over to the kingside, and he looks like he's ready to create a battery on the g-file, or just create, a steady defense. Bishop to h5 maybe is annoying at some points. So when you're better on one side of the board, but there's no clear breakthrough, you don't have to force a breakthrough. Just look to see if you can get better on the other side of the board. And this was something that world champion Anatoly Karpov was really good at. And that's why I played the following move, a5. Using this mentality of, I'm going to win on one side of the board, now let me win on this side of the board. I played this move a5 with the idea that if I can create an open a-file for my rook, then I'm in a much better position. Even if I wind up trading rooks on a1 and my opponent has a rook on a1, this doesn't really create problems for me, as now I can open up the king side and my opponent's king's kind of naked. So this posed a lot of problems for my opponent. Furthermore, if he plays b takes a5, the a3 pawn is really weak, and there's a lot of weak squares all of a sudden on the queen side. So my opponent decided he had no other move but to kind of do a Control-Z undo on his last move, rook to a1. And here I just continued to improve my position. I played bishop to d7, controlling the a4 square for his knight, so knight a4 isn't possible, but also controlling the b5 square. This was just kind of like a maneuvering move. There's really no rush to kind of break through yet. My opponent played queen to c2. I was like, okay, rook to g8. My opponent played queen to d1. I played rook to g7, with the idea of creating a battery at the right moment. My opponent played queen to d2, and here I played a sneaky move, rook to e8, which my opponent overlooked completely with the move rook to g2. So my objective here was to kind of force my opponent's queen to go back to d1 before playing rook to g8, so my opponent's rooks were disconnected. But by playing rook to e8 and having my opponent play rook to g2, he missed a very simple tactic. Let's see if you can find it. So here, I found the move g takes f4, which was my original plan. G takes f4, and now the exclamation point move, knight takes f4 exclam. The idea here is that I'm creating this passed pawn on the e-file. When he takes e takes f4, I can push e3, forking the bishop and the queen, and opening up this e-file with this battery between my rook and my queen. Good luck to my opponent trying to get any counterplay. Rook takes g7. Well, bishop takes g7 is kind of obvious. You don't want to allow any unnecessary checks on g1. Here my opponent decided to take. And now the endgame I thought was kind of instructive, because here, pawns are still technically equal. I'm about to win on c3, but the job isn't done yet, and it's very important to have good technique in the endgame. So my opponent played bishop to f1. I grabbed a pawn. My opponent played knight to d1. That's fine. I threw in this check. My opponent played bishop to g2. So right now, my opponent's bishop is pinned. Let's see if I can make this knight not be able to move. And I found a way. Bishop takes d4. This knight now is completely stuck. None of the squares it can move to, it can play safely. So my opponent had to move his rook out of the way. Well, there's really only one square for that too, rook to b1. So my opponent's trying to generate play on the b-file, maybe open the b-file and play like rook to b7 or something. Well, that's fine. I'm just going to play this move a4. And now my opponent has a really hard time getting into the position. B5, rook to b4, this is really slow. Meanwhile, I can trap his knight on b1. So all of my opponent's pieces are actually stuck, meaning the only piece he can move, really, is his king. So king to g3, bishop to e6. I don't want this d5 pawn to go down. These 3 pawns, even though they block into my bishop, do a really good job of making my opponent's bishop have no options. King to h2, king g6, and now I'm going to trade places between my king and my bishop. So now my king is protecting the pawn. Let's bring in my bishop. So he played king to f3. I played check. Back to g3. That's fine. I attacked the knight because now the knight is attacked twice and it has no squares it can go to. So my opponent tried to block the attack with bishop to f3. But that's fine. When you dominate pieces like this, you always have a lot of options. And in this case, I had the move rook to d3. So now my opponent's in complete shambles. He played knight to b2. I grabbed the knight, and then I grabbed the bishop. And the rest of the endgame is pretty simple. So I grabbed some pawns, I made sure his rook couldn't enter in my side of the board, and I just continued pushing my pawns, and at the end of the day, there was really just nothing he could do. So once we reached this position, I queened, and the game was over. So what did we learn about this game in terms of static advantages? Well, I've had a lot of live chess games that I've put on my channel previously where I talk about developing a small advantage, or putting your pieces on the best possible squares, but I never really put that in terms of phases of the game. You see, Dorfman didn't really believe in opening, middle game, and end game. He believed in static phases and dynamic phases, meaning that, for the most part, a game will follow a general course. Like, the position is set in terms of what the best plans are for both sides for a period of, I don't want to put a number to it, but a period of moves. And then a major decision will happen in which one side will have to decide if they want to change the flow of the game or if they want to continue the pace of that game. By changing the moment of that game, that is a dynamic moment. Usually we have anywhere from 2 to 3 critical moments to maybe even 10 or 11 critical moments in a game. And in this game, what I was able to do was, by playing a low-rated player, I got my static advantage, and I eliminated any of his tactical potential by eliminating all dynamic possibilities. My opponent never had an opportunity to try to challenge me in this game because I took full control over the center, and then I worked around that, working on both sides of the board. So I hope you learned a little bit from this game. I'll be posting another video next week. Make sure to follow me on chesssummit.wordpress.com, and I'll be seeing you soon. As for now, this is Isaac Steincamp signing off the Chess Summit Network.